Okay, so now we're going to talk about the connections that the nervous system makes to other body systems. And to do this, we are going to talk about the 4 blood-brain CSF barriers, okay? So, the 4 blood-brain CSF barriers. Okay, so there are a couple of things we need to define first. The first, which we've already mentioned before, is the ventricular system. The ventricular system. Okay, this system is very important when it comes to the connections that our nervous system makes to other body systems. Okay, and we did mention this very briefly when we talked about glia. Maybe you'll remember why. Okay, so the ventricular system is 4 interconnected cavities, or they're 4 interconnected ventricles. Okay, that's why it's called the ventricular system. Ventricles, which basically is just a fancy word for cavities or tunnels, okay? Cavities or tunnels. And this is where the cerebrospinal fluid, is produced. Okay? The ventricular system of the brain is connected to the central canal of the spinal cord. I'm pretty sure I mentioned that before. And this is the structure that creates the 4 barriers between the blood vessels, so our circulatory system, our nervous system, this is in the brain mostly, and CSF, which is the part of the nervous system that interfaces, that connects it to the immune system, okay? So let's talk a little bit. Okay, so this is where the CSF is produced, and the ventricular system of the brain is connected to the central canal of the spinal cord and it creates the 4 barriers between, there's my eraser. Between brain tissue, blood vessels, and the immune system. Okay, so let's really quickly define CSF. So what is CSF exactly? CSF, or cerebrospinal fluid. Okay. All right, so this is a clear and colorless fluid in the brain and spinal cord, produced and circulated in the ventricles by ependymocytes or ependymal cells. These were one of the glia that we talked about, okay? So it is a clear, colorless fluid in the brain and the spinal cord, and it is both produced and circulated in the ventricles by ependymal cells. Okay, so what does CSF do? So the first thing it does is it cushions the brain inside of the skull. Cushions brain inside skull. Okay, so your brain is actually floating in cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, and then that way when you move your head around, it's not knocking against the bone of your skull. Okay, so in this way it provides both mechanical and immunological protection. Okay, it helps distribute substances like nutrients or neuromodulators between brain cells, and last but not least, it removes waste products from the brain. Removes waste products. Okay, so this fluid, very important fluid. Okay, let's draw two views of our ventricle system. Okay, so let's start with black. And the first view is going to be a side view. Okay, so here is my brain. Here is the cerebellum. It's very wrinkly. Here is the brainstem down to the spinal cord. Okay, so where are the ventricles? So deep inside of your brain. So first, we come up from the spine, the central canal of the spine. Okay, and just about here, there's a big chamber that goes into the cerebellum, kind of bumps up like this. All right. Okay. Then it has a very small connection to another chamber that kind of has these like spiky bits. Okay. And then it has another small connection. And this is all deep inside. Think like really in the middle of your brain. This is where it gets a little three-dimensional. So these are all right in the middle. And then there are two branches that are symmetrical that go to the two halves of your brain, okay? And these are called the lateral ventricles. They kind of do something like this. Okay, so this is passing on the outside. And there's another one going to the other side of the brain, okay? All right, so let's label these. So because even though we drew it starting from the spine, because I think that makes sense, we discovered them from the top down. So these two horns are called the lateral ventricles. Okay, and lateral means on either side of your midline. The middle line of symmetry that divides your body up and down, because we have two eyes, we have two nostrils, we have two ears, okay? So on either side, we have two ventricles, okay? Then the lateral ventricle connects, because there's one, two on either side. So this one is called the third ventricle. So then this last one is called the fourth ventricle. And then this is the spinal canal, okay? Central canal, actually. So this is the central canal of spinal cord, okay? So that's one view of our ventricle system. And just as a reminder, we have two lateral ventricles, so I'll put ×2 right there. Okay, so now let's look, so this is from the side. Let's look at it if we were looking at it from the front, okay? All right, so first of all, let's draw our brain, which now we have the two hemispheres, okay? And then we have the lobe right next to our ears called the occipital lobe, okay? Then we have the cerebellum, which again is very wrinkly. And then we have brainstem and spine. Okay, and this time I'm going to draw the ventricles in blue because they are filled with this fluid. All right, so what you're going to see is here's the central canal. Okay, then it opens up to the fourth ventricle. Kind of looks like that. Then it narrows down again. And then the third ventricle, from this angle, it just kind of looks like this. Okay? And then you have the lateral horns. Like that. Okay? And actually, on the inside of the horns, there are two major blood vessels that go into the inside of the brain, okay? So I'm just going to draw them very basic, like this. All right, and we'll fill in the blood vessel. Okay, so now we're starting to see maybe all the different connections that are possible here. And then I mentioned that your CSF, the cerebral spinal fluid, also cushions your nervous system from the surrounding skeleton. So there's also a layer of cerebrospinal fluid on the outside here. Okay. So let's fill in the inside just so that the image is a little more clear what's going on. Okay. So yeah, your brain is not just a mass of cells, okay? Because all of these cells, they need to get nutrients, they need to get oxygen, you need to remove the waste products. And if there's too many cells packed together without something to help move things around, all those cells will just die, okay? So our brain is, it's a lot of cells packed into one space. So it needs to have some kind of infrastructure there to make sure that food gets to all of the cells and that any waste products get removed, any dead cells get removed. Very important. Okay, I'm just gonna kind of scribble this in. I'm not gonna be super neat about it, but you should feel free to make your drawings as beautiful as you want. I will look at every single one of them and appreciate them deeply. Okay, so we have the ventricular system, we have the surrounding CSF. Okay, so this is the fluid that's cushioning your brain. And on the outside of all of that is your skull. So the skull would come around like this, and then it would cut across here, and then the rest would be your spinal column, which is also more bones, but a little more flexible. Okay, so we not only have a blood vessel right here in the middle, but we also have lots of blood vessels running from outside of the skull into the CSF. So we have like a nice vein here. And then some of it goes into the CSF. Okay. And then some of that connects more deeply into the brain. Okay, so something kind of like that, more or less. All right, so where are our four barriers? Our four barriers are, so we first have the brain CSF barrier, which I'm actually going to include the skull as well, so you'll see why in just a second. All right, so that's our first one. I've run out of good colors for writing. So I'll just do it in black. So here is one, the brain CSF barrier. Okay? Then next, we have This is probably one that you've heard of before, the blood-brain barrier, okay? And this is between the brain tissue and the little capillaries that go into the brain from the surface, okay? I'll do this. Then the second one is the blood-brain barrier. Okay. Then the third one is the CSF and brain barrier here. Okay. So that's 3. CSF brain barrier. And the reason why it's different from the brain CSF barrier is because the CSF brain barrier is the barrier that is inside of the brain, connecting the brain tissue to the ventricular system, okay? The inside part is the ventricular system. This is how it connects to the CSF on the outside of the brain. And then the last one is our blood CSF barrier. So 4 is the blood CSF barrier. Okay. All right, so let's really quickly talk about these. All right, yes, cool. All right, so number 1, the brain CSF barrier. I'm gonna give myself a tiny bit more room. Okay, so number 1, the brain CSF barrier. Okay. There are a couple of components, including the skull, so I'm going to draw all of them. Okay, so first you have on the very outside, you have the skull. Yeah, I'll do it in purple. So, skull, nice and thick. This is a strong bone. Very important for protecting one of our most important organs. Okay, so here is our skull. Then on the inside of that, I'll use black. Okay, connected and attached to the skull is what's called dura mater, okay? It's a very thick, durable membrane, like a wrapper, okay? But it's connected directly to the skull. And then it has a bit of an empty space called the sinus, and then it has another layer . Okay, so this is your dura mater, and those are the membranes, and in here it's just an empty space called the sinus. It's not entirely empty though, because that's where the veins, the blood vessels from the skull, they also run through here, okay? Then after that, we have a layer called the arachnoid mater. Okay, so the dura mater, arachnoid mater. We're going to define all of these, don't worry. And the arachnoid mater actually, it dips into the sinus area. Let me make this a bit wider. In these like folds, okay? And it's made of these really tightly packed cells, okay? So this is the arachnoid mater, okay? Then there's a much bigger space. So the arachnoid mater, it's called arachnoid because it looks kind of like a spider web. There's kind of like a spider webby space, okay? So it kind of looks like a net. Okay? And then at the far end of it, we have our third and last membrane that surrounds the entire brain. And that's called the pia mater. It's made of a bunch of little cells stacked right next to each other. The pia mater. Okay? And then just on the other side of the pia mater are something that we've talked about before. There are the feet, the very ends of astrocyte projections, and those are called glia limitans. That's just a fancy word. That really means it's the very far end. So remember astrocytes, they have a cell body, and then they have, some of them have these long arms with like little feet at the end. Those line up right here next to the pia mater, okay? And this is called glia limitans, which is just a fancy word for the astrocytic feet, okay? And then on this side, finally, is brain tissue. Okay, so where is the CSF? The CSF is here in the arachnoid mater, and actually this space is called the subarachnoid space. And this is where the CSF is. Okay? So these are all the components that make up the barrier between the brain tissue and the CSF running along the outside of the brain. Okay, so now let's define some words. Here we go. Dura mater. Okay, so this is a thick and durable membrane that is attached to the skull. Okay, it's one of three membranes: dura mater, arachnoid mater, and pia mater. Those are all made out of connective tissue. It's like the same material that makes your tendons and your ligaments, okay? It surrounds and supports this sinus area, and that's where the blood vessels are, okay? So we've got a blood vessel running through here. And there's blood vessels on the outside of the skull that come in, and they run around in the sinus area. Okay, and then from the sinus area, thanks to, okay, we'll talk about that in just a second. So, the dura mater, it surrounds and supports the dural sinuses, okay? Dural sinuses, which, what do? They receive blood from the cerebral veins, from cerebral veins, and they receive CSF from the subarachnoid space, and they take it away from the brain by emptying into your jugular vein, okay? The big vein that runs down the side of your neck, okay? And receives CSF from the subarachnoid space, and they empty into the jugular vein. Okay. All right, so these dimples, they allow CSF to enter the sinus, okay? And the dura mater, it carries blood from the brain back to the heart, okay? So that's what it's doing with the dural sinuses. Okay, great. Next, we're going to define the arachnoid mater. Okay? And remember I said it was named arachnoid because it looks like a spider web, arachnia, arachnids, okay? So this is the second membrane that surrounds both the brain and the spinal cord, but it's very loose, okay? It's not tight against either the dura mater or the brain, okay? So it's a very loose membrane. Okay, so second membrane surrounds the brain plus spinal cord very loosely. Okay? And like I said, in this space between the arachnoid mater and the pia mater, that's where the CSF is flowing. And these little bumps are called arachnoid villi. Let's see, what color can I use that will stand out? So this is called arachnoid villi. Villi mean like, like little fingers, okay? So these are small protrusions or bumps through the dura mater into venous, into the sinuses, so this sinus area, which allows the CSF, the cerebrospinal fluid, to exit the subarachnoid space and enter the bloodstream by interacting with the veins inside of this sinus area. Okay. So, the outer layer here, right next to the dura mater, like I said, are tightly packed cells to make a strong barrier, but the inside is more just like a web, okay? It's very loose, very flowing. Okay, the last one, the last membrane is the pia mater. Okay, so the pia mater is the innermost and the most delicate and thin membrane. Okay, very thin and delicate innermost membrane. All right. It adheres to the surface of the brain, so it's like glued on to the surface of the brain, and it follows all the bumps and crevices, which are called gyri and sulci. So it adheres to surface of brain and the spinal cord. Okay, so it adheres to the surface of the brain and the spinal cord, and it follows all contours. So what I mean by that is, if the brain, you know how like the cortex is wrinkled? Where it's wrinkled, the pia mater is right there with it. It just follows it all the way around, okay? And in neuroscience terminology, when it bumps out towards the outside of the brain, this is called a gyrus, G-Y-R-U-S. And when it bumps into the brain, that is called a sulcus. You probably will never really need these words, but they're there in case you need to know them. And this pia mater is also pierced by blood vessels, okay? So the blood vessels, they just kind of pass through, and then they pierce the pia mater in order to get into the brain, okay? When the blood vessel is passing through the subarachnoid space, nothing leaves. Nothing from the blood goes out, and nothing from the CSF goes in. It's very tight and blocked here. And then, as you'll find out, once it gets all the way into the brain tissue, that's when things can go in and out from the blood vessels to the brain. Okay. And last but not least, the glia limitans. This is just a fancy term for the feet of astrocytes. Okay, so if we remember our astrocyte, it would have a long thing like this. Okay, maybe another one going off like this. Okay, so these, oh wait, we forgot to give it a nucleus. Okay, so these are the astrocytic feet. That's the glia limitans. So right up against the pia mater, there's a bunch of astrocytes putting their feet up there to help create that barrier, okay? All right. So that's it for the brain CSF barrier. Next, we're going to talk about the blood-brain barrier. And I'm going to erase this, but this is a good time for you to pause the video if you want, okay? And then we'll come back.